with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Monday, July 17th, 2023. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Daniel Bessner Derek Davison, co-host of the American Prestige podcast on NATO's past, present, future. Also on the program today, with 14 days until the deadline, head of the Teamsters tells Joe Biden, don't intervene with our potential strike. It's day 76 for 11,000 writers and day 3 for 160,000 actors on strike against the film and television producers and streamers. Meanwhile, Ukraine sea drone strikes Russian Crimea bridge. Russia pulls out of the Black Sea grain deal. China has its hottest day ever as U.S. swelters. And AIPAC Dems attack Jayapal for speaking the truth on Israel. New numbers are out. Biden's small donor contributions at half the pace of Obama's. And Ron DeSantis. DeSantis?
I like that, actually.
I don't know.
DeSantis. Losing DeSantis.
Ron DeSantis is cratering in about 4 different ways. Lastly, a federal judge in Oregon says that Oregon's gun control law is constitutional. That is a Trump judge. All this and more on today's Majority Report. All this and more. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted. I started the show off wearing a goofy hat, and of course, it was just a joke.
Take it off and say, "Milady."
No one would ever go in any space wearing a hat like this. So
No, yeah.
I mean, to be taken...
Unless they were a really good investigator.
Right,
yes,
right.
or I'm trying to be V from Vendetta. No, it's just me.
I'm getting to the bottom of this imperialism stuff.
All right, come on, that's silly. Grow up. It's Monday. Hello, Emma. I don't know why everybody's so giddy. I know why. It's because we're all have heat stroke because we don't have AC.
It's better today. It was supposed to be fixed on Friday.
They were supposed to come on Friday, and I was waiting here until about 5:30 or 6, like 3 hours after the show, and then I find out it just made more sense for them not to come.
Yeah.
When they had scheduled it, and then it made more sense for them to come.
It's Friday. I know how. I know
Saturday on Monday on 3, and so that's the air conditioner. All right, let's get right into this. We got a lot to talk about today. The deadline for the UPS, for the Teamsters, UPS drivers, to come to terms with UPS management, I believe it's July 31st. We have been talking about this for at least 6 or 7 months. It may have been as early as at the end of last year, actually. UPS, the Teamsters, have been on a collision course, forgive the pun, for months over this. Now, we have 180,000 people on strike against the television film business. We have other strikes going on. The Starbucks workers. Where was it where is it?
Louisville.
Louisville. Are striking today with some other coffee folks. There are 10 cafes that were shut down in Louisville with strikes. Not just Starbucks, but another. Could you go back? I don't know what the other name of that. At Sunergos. I don't know what that means.
I guess that must be another
maybe
coffee
cafe
shop,
thing.
yeah.
But I mean, and of course there are other strikes that are happening around the country in between. The point being that we have a lot of people on strike, and there's going to be a lot of labor action, I think, in the coming months or so. So here is AOC down in New York, and we should say the head of the Teamsters said to the Biden administration, and it's interesting that they did this early. This is a way to create more pressure on management, because it jams up Biden. If Biden enters in and does so before there's even and has been warned before there's a strike, it puts that much more pressure on Biden. Smart move by the Teamsters to basically say, we're not striking now. So this isn't coming out of nowhere. It's just a way of saying, you stay on your side of the fence, because, and let's be honest, Biden hasn't had the best record of getting involved in these things. We saw it with the rail strike.
Yeah. And this has
Julie Su did go out with the Teamsters. With the Longshore and out in on the West Coast, and help at least resolve it, or I don't know if they actually came to a deal, but that was the last report that I heard. But this is the way the Teamsters are going to flex their muscle. They're going to basically say, sideline the government here and just say, we're going to, and we always hear that libertarians don't like government to pick winners and choosers. Okay, let's put labor up against it, and I should make it clear. Our government does that every day. Every government in the world picks winners and choosers. It's just winners and losers. It's just which one society decides we want to win or lose in that situation. But here's AOC in New York talking to UPS drivers.
Cortez. I'm from the Bronx. We're out here in Queens today, and I'm not the only one here from the Bronx. We got Danny Kane and Tommy Oliver from Local 202 out in Hunts Point coming here to offer our support. We just want you all to know that we have your back. We have your back, and we say we mean this city has your back. This country has your back. Everyday people have your back, because you're not just fighting for yourselves. You are fighting to raise the standard for all working people in this country. This is the largest strike authorization in American history. 340,000, sorry, I had a couple extra zeros there. Over 340,000 workers have authorized a strike from UPS. That is an enormous amount. That is the largest strike in American history. Danny and I were just talking. We think this is one of the largest strike authorizations and labor actions in the world going on right now. And when we do that, and when we're going to claim it right now, when we win that, we are going to raise that average, raise that standard for all workers. We cannot accept a dual standard where part-time workers and full-time workers doing the same labor are getting paid dramatically different wages. We can't allow for that. UPS made $16 billion in profit last year alone. $16 billion with a B. That is a level of richness and wealth that we really cannot wrap our minds around. They can afford AC in our trucks. They can afford to pay part-timers equal wage. They can afford to pay people enough to live in New York City and across the country. They can afford to make sure that everybody can feed their babies, clothe their kids, and lead a dignified life for themselves and pay rent in New York City.
It is helpful, and we've heard this from union people and people who not just longtime union people, but people who've started up unions and more grassroots organizing, that having elected officials out there, out in front, is helpful. And I think AOC probably learned a lesson from what it was that prevented her from being out there with Amazon early in the process. It may have just been scheduling, may have been poor communication, whatever it is. Regardless, she's making sure that's not happening this time. And that's the trajectory that you want with our politicians. And in many ways, I think, we're going to see her picking up the baton from Bernie Sanders, who on the reg would do this kind of thing. And so she's doing this in New York, but this is going to, make no mistake about it, this is going to be a nationwide strike, obviously.
340,000, that's the number. It's a lot of people. This is what the largest private sector contract on the continent. And then Teamsters represent half of that workforce. So that's the reason that's good that O'Brien came out and pressured Biden ahead of time, because the pressure from the people that he's listening to is going to be to weigh in on behalf of management to prevent disruption. It was a very smart move to get that out of the way early, even before there's a strike. We'll take a break in a second. Someone's writing me on IM. I think SAG-AFTRA said to wait for them to ask for subscription cancellations. Yes. Right. If you head over to SAG-AFTRAstrike.org, there is a FAQ there for influencers and influencers across the board, like professional influencers. I guess like people like us, maybe. I don't know if we're influencer.
That's how I think of myself.
That's more of but for people who are just like if you're gonna go on social media, they are giving instructions as to what the parameters are that they want to get done now. And one of those is just don't promote any, TV or films. As opposed to starting with the rollback of subscriptions, I think they want to roll that out later. But we will see, and we'll be on top of that. We're going to hear from a couple of words from our sponsors, from me. And then we'll be talking to Daniel Bessner and Derek Davison, co-host of the American Prestige podcast, in the wake of the big summit in Vilnius, Lithuania last week over NATO. Full disclosure, I think part of my family came from Vilnius.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's a connection.
That doesn't in any way influence the coverage.
It's the Worcester of Europe, they call it.
Many people are saying.
Very well, maybe. Folks, what are the reasons you need to hydrate? I use Liquid IV. Everybody knows this, right? Every single day, I do at least one of these bottles. Sometimes I'll do two, full of Liquid IV, because it keeps me hydrated during the show, and it keeps me hydrated for the rest of the day. Maybe I'll have some later in the day as well, but every day, this is the way I start my day out. But I got Sol on it. Sol, my son is very partial to hoodies, and he goes out, and in this weather, my big fear is dude, you're going to be completely dehydrated, and this is how I take care of it, Liquid IV. It's also something you go on a flight. I'm also having to stay in hotels occasionally right now. I'm not even going to get into it, but and it's nothing. It dries you out big time. So for me, Liquid IV, which is apparently the #1 powdered hydration brand in America. There's been they've added something, a twist, if you will, which I got to say I'm very excited about. And I knew they would do this. I just didn't know when. They have now their hydration multiplier comes in sugar-free flavors as well. And they use a proprietary zero sugar hydration solution with no artificial sweeteners, which is really big based upon what's in the news these days. 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 vitamins and nutrients for everyday wellness. Liquid IV hydrates 2 times faster than white water alone. They have 3 new flavors that are sugar-free. Green grape, lemon lime, and what I got going today white peach.
White peach. I haven't heard of that one yet.
No, peach is great. But I also like the green grape. And then the lemon lime I go to, I like all three flavors.
Yeah.
It comes in these very easy, convenient packages, perfect for travel, or even like when you're out and about, you buy a bottle of water, you drop it in there, you're set. They have these new flavors in addition to a bunch of other great flavors they have but these, again, 3 new flavors that are sugar-free. In one stick of liquid IV, you mix it with 16 ounces of water. It hydrates you, like I say, 2 times faster. It has B3, B5, B6, B12, and vitamin C. It has 3 times the electrolytes of leading sports drinks. Made with quality ingredients, nothing GMO, free from gluten, free from dairy, free from soy. And they not only has Liquid IV donated like over almost close to 40 million servings in 50 countries around the world, helping people stay hydrated, they partner with leading organizations to fund and foster solutions to help communities protect their water and their futures. Real people, real flavor, real hydrating. Now sugar-free. Grab your Liquid IV Hydration Multiplier sugar-free in bulk nationwide at Costco, or get 20% off when you go to liquidiv.com and use the code MajorityRep at checkout. That's 20% off anything you order when you use the promo code MajorityRep. I'm not saying that wrong. MajorityRep at liquidiv.com. Also, today's sponsor, one of my favorite sponsors, SunsetLakeSebede.com. It is a majority worker-owned company. $20 minimum wage. They grow all the hemp they use in their products. They have no pesticides. They use integrated pest management. They also use regenerative farming practices. I mean, just great for the land, great for their people. Their product is third-party tested, and you can see the entire breakdown of what's in it. All the different variants of what could be in Sebede. You could check it out. And they're great movement partners. We've talked about this. They give thousands to all sorts of organizations. Right now, they have a special sale on their tincture. 35% off. You can use it to go to bed. They have a tincture with melatonin. You can use it just to be chilled during the course of the day when your kid's driving you nuts. You can give some, they have pet tinctures as well. They have tinctures in 3 different flavors: original, citrus, and mint. They have it in different concentrations, so you can really find the dose that works right for you. Save 35% when you use the code TINCTURE at checkout. And like I say, these guys are movement partners. They have been they were longtime fans of the show, and they're good people. Sunset Lake Sebede going to be donating 10% of the sales to the Vermont Flood Response and Recovery Fund, set up by the Vermont Community Foundation to help those who've been affected by the disastrous flooding. They're from outside of Burlington, and they've just, are constantly doing stuff to help their community. Now is a great time to stock up on tinctures, folks. Visit sunsetlakesebede.com. Use the code TINCTURE at checkout. You'll get 35% off. The deal ends tonight, so check it out. All right, quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking to Daniel Bessner and Derek Davison, co-hosts of the American Prestige podcast. We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Daniel Bessner, Derek Davison. They are co-hosts of the American Prestige podcast. And Derek also has a Substack newsletter, Foreign Exchanges, which you can find on Substack. Guys, welcome back to the program. You've been in one form or another. We're, I don't know, a week out from the NATO summit in Vilnius. Before we get to the summit and where we are, I don't know which one would of you want to take this question, but give us just sort of like the brief history of NATO since maybe, since 93, right? When the Soviet Union falls. I mean, I think everybody understands where NATO sort of developed in the wake of World War II, an alliance that was created across the Atlantic, between allies from World War II, but also in terms of like the burgeoning Soviet bloc. But since 93, give us a little bit of a thumbnail.
Sure, Derek, maybe I could start and you could correct me where I'm wrong. It's interesting to look back on what happened to NATO, because the question was, at the time, was the United States going to continue to try to dominate the world? The justification for U.S. hegemony for the previous half century was really that the Soviet Union, if it wasn't confronted, would take over the world and communism would go forward. So the question was there going to be a peace dividend that was going to be used to, spend money on things like social welfare instead of military alliances abroad, particularly when there was no perceived existential threat? And NATO was related to that. It was maybe, the prime discussion when we were talking about the transatlantic alliance. But of course, the U.S. did continue to commit itself to hegemony. And since 1993, roughly speaking, NATO has become more and more involved in a bunch of areas that it previously didn't really do. It had deployed troops in Eastern Europe. It even deployed troops out of area in 2011, right, Derek, during Libya. So I think the story over the last 30 years is just NATO becoming larger and larger, doing more and more things that it didn't really do during the Cold War, and becoming really a synecdoche for U.S. empire and the United States' desire to dominate writ large.
Well, we should also say the troops are deployed in Afghanistan. NATO has a part of their treaty is that you attack one of us and the rest of us will come, and that's what justified their involvement in Afghanistan. Although oddly, it wasn't necessarily Afghanistan that was attacked us on 9/11. I mean, there's a lot of asterisks there. Let's put it that way. But let's go, Derek, let's go to 2004, where, 11 years after, and the ostensible sort of justification, rationale for NATO sort of falls apart, right? And maybe, and at that time, there was a deal struck with Ukraine of their defense to get rid of nukes. And I remember in 93, the sort of the peace dividend that was going to show up and never sort of did. And but in 2004, there's an expansion. Just talk a little bit about that, because that really gives you a sense of where this is all going.
I mean, I think, to sort of build on what Danny was talking about, and also to pick up on something you said there, which was NATO's ostensible purpose is no longer relevant. I think if you dig into what NATO was really supposed to be about, and there's a great piece in the New York Times maybe a week ago now by Gray Anderson and Thomas Meany that really argues that NATO was never really a Cold War defense alliance. It was an arm of American empire. It was a way to maintain U.S. hegemony over European politics in a much broader sense than just defense. But it was a way to keep U.S. military contractors selling weapons. It was a way to make sure that basically U.S. primacy was maintained across Europe throughout that period. And I think that just continued. So in a sense, its real mission never went away, and in fact was expanded after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So that expansion that you get in the expansion that you get in the 90s and then in 2004 into Central Eastern Europe, into places that were very much in the Soviet periphery during the Cold War, that's just a natural continuation of this process, and it's part of the story. If we talk about the war in Ukraine and the drama obviously that surrounds Ukraine potentially becoming a NATO member, is this steady expansion into Eastern Europe, which of course you get arguments that NATO that effectively take NATO's agency away in a sense. These countries wanted to join NATO, so don't they have the right to do so? Which they have the right to apply, I guess, but NATO doesn't have necessarily any obligation to admit these places. But it is part of the backdrop to escalating Russian grievances over the past now 30 years about its relationship with the West.
Now, my understanding, though, and recollection was in 2004 in that expansion, Putin did not have, and he was relatively new, but he did not have or make an issue, let's put it that way, I guess, with the expansion of that. And if I remember correctly, like half of, maybe it was 7 or 8 countries, and maybe a half of them were literally part of the USSR, and then the other half, more or less, you guys will know the details, were part of the Warsaw Pact. So they were basically, within they were in the, I guess, the Iron Curtain version of NATO, if you will. And there was no big issue with that, but it clearly NATO, like, well, let me ask you this question, because clearly NATO could have said, no, sorry, that's not what our plan is, to expand our membership. But why did these countries want to join NATO at that time?
Yeah, I think the way to describe it is that these were countries that were part of the USSR, were part of the Eastern Bloc, but weren't core countries like a Georgia or Ukraine. They were countries that, for example, if you look at Lithuania, a country that went back and forth between the Nazis and Soviets between 1939 and 1941. So they were part of it, but they weren't core. And I think that explains why later on in 2008, Putin got more concerned with what he considered to be NATO expansion. But the reason that these countries would want to be part of NATO is obvious. They don't want I almost said the Soviet Union. They don't want the Russian Federation to invade them. They don't want to be pressured by the Russian Federation. This provides some sort of shield against Russian encroachment and Russian pressure. So it's very obvious and understandable why these countries would want to be part of NATO. But the question that I think we as Americans or people within this country have to ask is, how does that relate to the perceived national interest? Because there are lots of countries around the world that would want the United States or alliances to provide for their defense. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to do that, because that could be, if you consider the U.S. empire to be a problem, that would just necessarily mean the total expansion of the U.S. empire. And I think this gets into difficult questions when you have populations genuinely want to be part of this alliance. Does that necessarily mean that we should allow them to join, or that, left-wing critics, people who don't like things like war and imperialism even, should allow them to join? And it raises really thorny questions that I think got played out a lot in this recent Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I want to get us up to that point too, but I'm going to set this table a little bit more too, because one of the issues, the thing that fascinates me about, particularly around this topic when we're talking about foreign policy, is that regardless of ideology, it is attempted to be fought on the playing field of what's best for U.S. national security interests. And everybody tries to carry that banner as if there is this sort of objective notion of what is in a country's best national security interest. And it's almost like, there's an analog somewhere into sort of like economy, the economy in some way. And, you could, and I think in some interest, like you could say like the Project for New American Freedom, a New American Century guys, and I have that on my head because I'm old. But when they were looking for the U.S. to be a hyperpower, NATO is a big part of that. The idea that we're going to have hegemony in a world where we're not going to have a superpower, and we need a bunch of low-level conflicts to exist around the world. And as long as we're sort of riding above that, we're okay. So what is, like, how do you guys define what is in U.S. national security interests? Like, what are the elements that create that sort of idea for you? Derek, why don't you start, and then Danny, you'll go next.
I mean, I view this increasingly on a global perspective. The challenges that really threaten the United States or anybody are climate change, pandemic, global inequality, and the instability that brings. And these are problems that have to be worked out with international solutions and drawing battle lines and for, as you brought up the 2004 NATO expansion, which was, I think, an explicitly done in an anti-Russian way. These were countries that wanted protection from Russia. That was their rationale for joining NATO, which is part of what has kind of caused this issue to become more charged, I think, from Putin's perspective or from Russia's perspective over time, that this is increasingly kind of an anti-Russia. It doesn't facilitate addressing the real threats that we face. I think to expand this to China, drawing battle lines or drawing sort of lines of control in the Pacific, and putting countries on an us or them footing with the U.S. and China. It's just counterproductive to these things. So my view is we're going in the opposite direction of national security right now with the priorities that we're laying out.
I agree with Derek, and I would even define national security interests rather narrowly, which is to basically defense of the homeland. So that's what it mostly meant for the majority of U.S. history. And during World War II, the United States started to adopt a much more expansive understanding of its world role for a variety of reasons, basically to protect the global commons and free trade, but also from a metaphysical perspective to there was this dream that there would be this thing called the American century, and the United States would metaphysically push history forward. And I think if you look at the actual history of U.S. foreign policy since World War II, it's basically been disaster after disaster, especially when you're talking about the global South, even though if it was pretty good for the European transatlantic core. So I think that the historical record suggests that if you don't have a rather restricted definition of national security, it leads to all sorts of foreign, I would say, imperial misadventures around the world, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I define it. The problem, though, as Derek identified, is that there are these genuinely global issues, climate, pandemics, that really need to be worked out with other countries. And then I just want to end with this quick thing. The bigger problem is that we have this global capitalist system, atop of which stands the United States, that is organized basically around Americans consuming an enormous amount of stuff. And so the political legitimacy of, political parties in this country and throughout the North Atlantic core rests on consumption. So there's a fundamental problem we have a system in which political legitimacy rests on consumption, and a world in which that consumption leads to things like climate change and destruction in the global South. So there is this fundamental tension that is confronting U.S. foreign policy that I never really hear spoke about, because if people did speak about it, it would basically reveal the total bankruptcy of the entire thing and the fact that we can't continue doing it like we have been.
I want to come back to that in a second, because it may in some way just completely make irrelevant the question I want to ask about how much did we move in a stage, if we went from security meaning protect the homeland to a more expansive notion of what security meant after World War II, was there an explicit era where we went from that to what it really means is protect corporate interests of specific players? Because we certainly did do that. And if we're not doing it now, which I find it hard to believe that we're not, but I mean, it's quite clear that a lot of it was explicitly corporate interest, which I should say is different from, but no less problematic in some ways. Our role, like our biggest stick, is the fact that we buy so much crap as a country. And therefore, if something bad happens to us, other countries will suffer because we're not buying their crap anymore. So it's almost like we're addicted to the heroin dealer doesn't want his main customer to OD, but he needs to keep using. But let's stay with the corporate one, then get to that other dynamic.
Sure. Just very quickly, what's really interesting is that in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, the U.S. empire protected American business. What happens in the 70s is that it begins to protect capitalism writ large and multinational corporations. And you see it's actually directly related to the second part of your question. We don't really produce stuff here any longer, right? We just consume stuff that is mostly produced elsewhere. And this has to do with the shift that happened in the 1970s from protecting American capitalism to protecting global capitalism, which is exactly what Marx predicted would happen. And you have the rise of an international bourgeoisie where a rich guy in New York shares more with a rich guy, let's say in Abu Dhabi or New Delhi, than he might with someone, 20 blocks away in New York City. And you have this very strange thing where capitalism became genuinely globalized in the 70s, which really complicates a lot of these issues you're talking about. I don't know, Derek, if you have anything to add to that.
I mean, there's a couple of things that I would say. One, not only does the United States wield power from the fact that we buy so much of everybody else's shit, but the fact that if one country wants to buy the shit from another country, they typically, although this is changing a bit, but they typically do it in dollars, and that creates a tremendous amount of control for the United States, and it's something that the empire has been. The interrelationship there between, the dollar dominance sustaining the empire, but the empire also existing to sustain the dollar's dominance is, I think, something that needs to be brought into the conversation. But increasingly, the other piece of this, I think, that's interesting in light of Ukraine especially, is we've gotten to the point where we're not just defending U.S. corporations. We're doing like arms expos. I mean, we're helping military contractors sell weapons overseas, and that's become a big piece of the international, the foreign policy of this country, and the military role is to show these things off. That's happening in Ukraine right now. I think. As a sidelight to this, part of the reluctance over the F-16, which I'm sure have talked about, to provide Ukraine with the F-16, is that the F-16 may not wind up working very well in Ukraine, and that would not be good for the people who make that plane if they want to sell it to other places. You think about when the last time the U.S. fought a war in truly contested airspace. The F-16 isn't really tested that way, and so I think there's a real fear about that. I would add that piece of it, the specific contractor, kind of boosting that goes on here.
I really, it is just impossible for me to sort of like parse out my feelings about the idea of F-16 going to Ukraine and everybody finding out like, oh, we're not going to spend our money on this, and it being a failed sort of like, I mean, aside from all the horrors that are going on there, just like that element of watching that weapon be found to be like a dud, at least in terms of like, it becoming sort of a non-sellable piece of equipment. But all right, so we're moving up through 2004, we're into 2008, and the Bush administration is talking about letting in. I think you mentioned this, Daniel. Letting in Ukraine and Georgia, but it's too controversial. So there's like some type of like compromise where we're going to talk about the idea in a sort of a general way. There's not going to be any type of like conditions or this and that, but like, it's like, we want to let you in type of thing. And that's where we've been, until this, summit, although obviously Russia attacks. Where are you guys on the scale of Russia attacked Ukraine because of NATO encroachment, or Russia attacked Ukraine because of domestic issues, etc.?
I mean, I land much more on the domestic issue side, I guess, if you're talking about immediate causes of the invasion. I don't think that there's anything NATO could have done in January of last year or February of last year that would have prevented this from happening. So if that's the time frame, and I know this is a heated debate between the folks who think that NATO expansion played a role here and the folks who reject that out of hand. But I think if you go back further than that and you look over a course of a couple of decades at NATO expansion and NATO's relationship and the U.S. relationship with Russia, and the mounting sense of kind of grievance and marginalization that was felt, 2008 was a big one, and I think Sam, as you mentioned, it was sort of the worst thing that you could do at that point, was to say, we vaguely want to let you guys into NATO, but we're not going to say when. We're not going to say what the conditions would be.
What's the best way for us to piss off everybody?
Yeah, we're just going to leave it hanging out here like this. It was just a really incredibly boneheaded decision across all fronts, and one that, as we now know, William Burns, who's the current director of the CIA under the Biden administration, was ambassador to Russia, said this is going to lead to a war, or it may very well lead to a war, because this is so antagonistic to the Russians that they're going to have a difficult time kind of. And
we should say he said this to Condi Rice. He worked for Condi Rice, who was ostensibly a Russian expert, and she didn't buy it, or she didn't get anywhere in the administration, in the Bush administration, to push that. But it did lead to a war, it seems to me, in 2014, right? I mean, in one fashion or another. And the Obama administration, as far as I can tell, basically said, like, we're going to be more or less hands off on this, because maybe in some, sort of vague acknowledgement that, like, moves maybe by the Bush administration in particular, and, over the years, may have like created these tensions, and we need to release this tension or some level. Is that a fairly accurate description?
I would even add it contributed to the war in Georgia in 2008. So we don't even have to go to 2014 to see that this was an antagonistic thing. Sorry, Danny, I know you were gonna jump in there.
No, I think that's precisely right with Obama. Particularly second term, Obama became quote unquote more realist, where he really did try to connect U.S. foreign policy to perceived national interests, and it just is very, very difficult to do when you're talking about Ukraine and Crimea, except if you're talking in basically expansive moral terms, or in this sort of vague, used when they want to and not used when they don't want to, idea of democracies versus autocracies. So Obama didn't want to make this a centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy, though, Derek, there was involvement since 2014 in the U.S. You might be able to talk about a bit better than I.
Well, yeah, there's been training. NATO trainers have been in Ukraine. There've been, not excuse me, not obviously on the level that we've seen over the last year and a half, but there's been military hardware that's been brought in to support the Ukrainians. I mean, people, may not necessarily understand that this was a frozen conflict for 8 years in the Donbass with a hardened battle line and shelling almost, if not on a daily basis, then fairly frequently. And there were certainly NATO trainers that came in to help the Ukrainians to support the Ukrainian military, and there was other involvement on a lower level than certainly we've seen since the invasion began.
And so this is the tension of U.S. foreign policy. Even if you want to disengage, you can't quite. There's always a low-level hum of involvement, which just exposes the imperial nature of the U.S. state. Okay, and so we're up to the most recent meeting of NATO. We have now NATO has now welcomed Finland, and Sweden is soon to join. Now that is wrapped up.
And Finland, notably a border state with Russia, which I feel like was hugely important to note. Yeah.
And fought with Russia in the last century a bunch of times. Yeah.
It feels like Putin miscalculated. Maybe the biggest understatement I could utter.
There's
right
no
now.
question.
I mean, if the agenda was, I can't imagine what any other agenda would be at this point. It miscalculated. He miscalculated both in terms of from a tactical and a strategic, regardless of whether it was external security or domestic. He just really blew it in a big way. It feels like.
I think it's a COVID war. I mean, I think he basically became increasingly isolated over COVID, and he became increasingly paranoid. And it's such an obviously terrible decision in every way, shape, or form. Before the war, neither Derek and I thought he would do it because it was so obviously a bad choice, a very difficult thing to accomplish. So he did everything that he didn't want to do. Most important, I wrote a piece for the Alameda Institute where I basically just read and analyzed everything that the U.S. has done. I mean, this has been a gift to the American empire. This has been a gift to getting European nations to recommit themselves to U.S. hegemony in Europe. This has been a gift to people who want the United States to remain forever armed and militarized and dominant abroad. So I think it's you can't even overstate how much of a failure this is from Putin's perspective, to say nothing of the domestic political costs, which are kind of difficult to really analyze, but clearly fairly significant, especially as Putin gets on in years, even though he's significantly younger than President Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Well, but Danny, I agree with that, and I think it's not just a COVID war; it's a legacy war. It's somebody who recognizes, and I know there's Kremlinology about Putin's health all the time, and that's kind of nonsense. But he is getting older. He's in the second of what's supposed to be a 2-term presidency. He'll undoubtedly find a way to stick around, but legally, at least, that's the way it sits. And Ukraine is Ukraine in Russian history and the Russian imagination. This is a core land, and Putin saw it kind of slipping out of that orbit, and I think didn't want his legacy to be losing Ukraine, if you want to put it that way.
It also seems to me to be, and I don't know to whose benefit this is, other than probably U.S. corporations, a real problem in terms of our relationship with China, because it is a little bit too emboldening, it feels like, and that NATO. I mean, I've read some of the pieces that you noted. Europe, this in some ways, maintains more U.S. hegemony over Europe, in the sense that there's no reason for Europeans, or no incentive for them to sort of build any sort of sovereign ability to defend themselves to the extent that they need to. And it makes them further, it seems in some ways, reliant on their relationship with the United States, which there's a lot of, it seems to me, forces in the U.S. that now wants to basically say, we're going to use that in our pivot to the Pacific, which has been ongoing now for 15 years. Well, I mean, depending on
it's a slow pivot. We're coming around the bend very.
We got bogged down in the Middle East.
Well, but
I'm
not convinced that was not part of like some people were pivoting earlier than others.
Yeah.
I mean, I've told this story many times, but in 2004, I interviewed Gary Hart, and he told this story about the 21st century. There was some commission he sat on with, I think it was with Rudman, about Senator Rudman from New Hampshire, if I'm not mistaken. And they were looking at the threats to the United States in the 21st century. And there was like 30 people sitting around a table, every one of them, and this was in the summer of 2001 or in the beginning of 2001, every one of them said non-state actors or some terrorist states, that type of thing. One person said China, and everybody sort of laughed. Went around again after 3 or 4 months. Same thing happened. They said China. They still laughed at this person. Maybe there was one more 3 months later where they did this, and she never showed up again. And it was Liz Cheney who was espousing that. And I'm quite convinced that because I have the Project for New American Century on the brain, that Iraq was also very much about making sure that we had control of the spigot in that region, because we wanted to, decide who at the keg party was going to get their first, their cups could be passed down first, and we didn't want it to be China. So, okay, let me ask you this: what do you, from the perspective of leftists, what should we be doing regarding Ukraine? Like, I mean, it has been. You've got 60 seconds. No, I'm joking. But honestly, like what?
Nothing, basically. We should be doing nothing. I mean, we should not be expanding around the world, sending weapons around the world to conflicts that are only peripheral to any possible perception of the national interest. Why should we do that? Why is this a hot take? Because I think people need to analyze what is the actually existing American empire done both abroad and at home. At home, we have a militarized society. We continue to empower defense contractors. We have a society organized around the military, and we're spending money on warfare when we should be spending money on welfare. But beyond that, if people want to say, well, that's selfish, Danny, what are you talking about? If you look at the actually existing history of the United States empire abroad, it's not really a question. Whenever the United States gets involved with a foreign country, basically bad things happen. I think the United States, for example, tried to covertly overthrow regimes during the Cold War 66 times. It succeeded in a certain amount of those, but every time that the U.S. got involved, or nearly every time the U.S. got involved, you have incidences of mass killing, you have democratic backsliding, you have human rights abuses and things along those lines. So from both a domestic and international perspective, we really need to restrict the power of the U.S. empire abroad and the military industrial complex at home, and constantly funding wars, even wars that are just. From, a dead alien perspective, if you were looking at it from 40,000 feet, it's absolutely horrible that Putin invaded Ukraine. But even wars that are just, if the United States just continues to be involved in them, then this empire will last forever, which I believe, and I think Derek agrees with me, is bad in both the short, medium, and long terms.
Well, but should we, the question then is, we made this agreement with Ukraine back in 93, 94 for them to get rid of their nuclear stockpile and us to come to their defenses. I mean, that is, I would say, the central question here, keeping our obligations and incentivizing further denuclearization from other countries by maintaining that promise.
I think you're right, Emma. There is an obligation there, and I think to some extent you have to say the Biden administration has been fairly measured here in limiting U.S. support to what it has been, and not escalating. And even this sort of dance that we go through with every new weapon system that the Ukrainians ask for, where the U.S. says no, and then it says maybe, and then it finally says yes. Even that is part of the process of kind of, I think, keeping this at a level that doesn't risk escalating into something much worse than it already is. But Sam, to get to your question, and my answer is kind of vague. hokum, I guess. But I think for the left, it's very important to support any outlet for diplomacy with respect to this conflict. And I was somewhat heartened to see, a little while ago there was the report of some kind of old retired or more retired kind of ex-U.S. diplomats engaging in some track 2 diplomacy, including Richard Haas, the former now I think president of the Council on Foreign Relations,
friend of our pod, Richard Haas.
Absolutely, friend of the pod, guiding light for American prestige. But anyway, just to see that happening at some level, and of course the immediate reaction to that was these people are all Vladimir Putin's puppets. Richard Haas is somehow on the Kremlin's payroll. But just to have any amount of negotiation going on, because it's so clear that there's very little of it happening right now, and it's equally clear that there's really no planning or thought being put into how this conflict ends. I think all the eggs were put into the basket of this counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are still engaged in, and somehow that was going to be a dramatic success. It hasn't been, and I'm not sure anybody knows what to do at this point. Diplomacy, even on kind of issues on the margin. The Black Sea Grain Initiative just fell apart today. The Russians pulled out of it.
Right.
That's going to have huge repercussions for global food security, and especially in places like Africa and the Middle East that are struggling anyway. Again, because of climate change and instability, struggling to feed themselves. Now this adds a whole new level of difficulty here. So my argument would be, it's important to support those efforts, just to keep talking, even if the talks aren't going anywhere right now. And I'm not saying, pressure Ukraine to surrender or anything like that. Just maintain some open channels of communication.
I tend to agree with that, but I also, I think increasingly, let me ask you this. And there's maybe no way for us to know this. because I've watched, there was an African mission maybe less than a month ago that went in an attempt to forge peace, and basically both sides said, "We'll talk to you later." Do you think that my sense has been from the beginning that Biden was very reluctant to get involved in this way. And then maybe as the Russians failed to complete a quick victory, it became almost just too enticing for Biden per se, but for the American, for the blob or what, all the interests that have in selling weapons, that this push became too extreme. Biden, it seems it took 2 or 3 weeks before there was even talk of providing weapons for Ukraine. And from what I've read of the reporting, the U.S. assumed this would be over in 5 days. That Russia would have at least seized control enough that there was no opportunity to do anything, maybe short of who knows what clandestine, but nothing sort of this significance. Is it from a leftist perspective? Should we be agitating to essentially say cut off weapons to Ukraine because then we would get a peace deal? It would be a surrender, presumably, right? And is it possible to assess what happens in the counterfactual where we offer no weapons and Ukraine falls? That's not necessarily a guarantee of peace, because if I'm Putin and I've taken over Ukraine and it took a couple of months, maybe even, why am I stopping?
Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think the Putin doesn't have the capabilities to really go further. I think if anything that the actual course of the war has demonstrated that.
Well, now,
very
but
difficult.
I'm saying now.
It's difficult to imagine.
But if he wins in 2 months without any support from the U.S., it's not like he made a rational decision when it came to Ukraine either.
Sure. That is basically the worry with every war. You know, if someone wins, they could just keep on going and going. And to me, that is almost a recipe for continued U.S. intervention abroad from now until eternity. So I think people need to ask themselves this. They need to take a look at the actual history of the U.S. empire and what has it actually done. And they have to ask themselves, if not now, when? There will always be a terrible thing for the United States to get involved in. This is just the nature of humanity and international politics in the world. There will always be a terrible injustice that the United States could theoretically get involved in. There are interesting questions about why we focus on this one and not other ones. For example, why has Eastern European wars gotten so much more attention than, say, wars in sub-Saharan Africa? There's probably clear, obvious reasons for that. But there are always terrible things around the world, and there are always counterfactuals that could be incredibly damaging. But to constantly go on worst-case scenarios, which is precisely how the United States has made foreign policy since World War II, is, to my mind, a recipe for this permanent empire, which, again, I think has done enormous damage to the world. So it's a question that there's no easy answer to it, because Americans do like to think of themselves somewhat as the subject of history, making moral pronouncements on the international stage. Americans like to have opinions about international affairs in a way that people from other countries don't necessarily do, because that is in some sense a privilege of empire. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think people need to ask themselves seriously, what has the U.S. empire actually done, and what is it likely to do in the future? Derek, I don't know if you disagree with that one.
Well, Daniel, wait, let me just ask about Emma's point, though, about the nuclear proliferation.
Right, that there are obligations. Yeah. There are moral obligations based on
well,
what
not
the
just
United
moral.
States did in life.
I mean, one of the worst things about Libya, in my mind, was that it destroyed the ability of the international community to make an assessment as to there's an imminent genocide about to happen, and we can be involved in a limited fashion to stop it. I mean, that there were real implications about that, because we had also sort of like said the same thing to Gaddafi. We're not going to topple you, it has an implication as to our ability to even engage with people and say, stop making nukes. And if you don't make nukes, we will do this. Give us your nukes. And if you do, we'll do that. I mean, we don't have great credibility, but we can still make it worse.
True. I mean, this to me is why you need some fundamental systemic transformation, because if you look at things like the International Criminal Court or international law, look at what countries they actually punish and look at what countries they actually don't. So this is, once again, a reflection of colonialism. It's a reflection of the global North dominating the global South, which is why if you actually look at Ukraine, most countries in the global South don't support what the United States is doing because they don't actually trust them. But I think you're right. That issue that happened with Gaddafi, he gave up the nukes, and then the United States kind of just let him be deposed. And in this case, it looks like Ukraine gave up its nukes, and probably in the long term, the United States will allow, if not total domination by Russia, some sort of significant influence of Russia in Ukraine. I don't see it going a different way, at least in the medium and long terms. And that's a real problem. But to me, if you want to attack that problem, you actually have to attack it at the level of the system as opposed to the individual case, because the individual case will always be defined by hypocrisy and lying, and the goal should be a nuclear zero world, and that has to be led by the United States with some form of unilateral, probably not total disarmament, but some form of disarmament. And also the United States should not remove itself from treaties that try to regulate nuclear weapons production and nuclear weapon
in terms of like Iran.
Iran is another example of our
Iran
being the big example, which was not a treaty, but nonetheless has set back the cause of non-proliferation.
Without a doubt.
Sorry,
without a doubt.
Please.
I'm a little more sanguine than Danny is about the weapons, and I think that I agree with Emma. There's an obligation here to support Ukraine based on that 93 or 94 agreement that under which they disarmed. But I think and again, this goes back to there being very little diplomacy happening here and very little sense of what could be a possible end game for this conflict. I think you can be discerning about what weapons you send to Ukraine. Are these weapons that would support defending the country, or are these weapons that are going to be used to try and take back Crimea, which would be, you know, a huge red line for the Russians? Or even, you know, even bigger, are these weapons that could be used to strike deep inside Russia? You know, these are questions that I think are worth asking.
How do you think the U.S. has done in that regard? Because that is also, I think, you know, sort of where, you know, where I draw my line in the sand, as it were, is that the you know, getting back to securing pre-invasion, like a status quo is the outer reaches, I think, of what we should be doing in this regard. If we are motivated by protection of the Ukrainian sovereignty and people.
That's not what motivates us. I would.
No,
think
I know that it probably is not. There are people who want to weaken Putin, but if the weapons are not provided to do that, and they're provided only to sort of maintain. But, you know, I'm also sympathetic to the arguments of like, well, then, you know, Putin can outlast in that situation. But
yeah, I mean, he can always outlast.
He can. I mean, depending on, you know,
how this ends. Yeah.
How many different, you know.
I mean, we were against on this show last week the cluster munitions, for example. Like these are things that we can, I think, be very thoughtful about. But I mean, there's no easy answers, as you say. I just am. I think it's a big picture view too to incentivize nuclear disarmament, and that's, I think, another dual track that we're looking at here in terms of like more broadly dismantling global systems of empire and domination, which is like very much connected to nuclear proliferation, I would say, in the 20th century, but and beyond.
Here's a hot take that people don't talk about. The IR theorist Kenneth Waltz, in one of his last articles, argued that the only truly safe world with nuclear weapons would be a world in which everyone had nuclear weapons. And increasingly, that seems to be the case, because I just don't see how disarmament is going to happen in any way, shape, or form. It's basically been a total non-starter for the most part. Maybe there was a little movement in the 80s and the 90s and the early aughts, but it hasn't really been much more. So maybe Iran should get a bomb. You know, this is an argument that a lot of IR theorists have made, because I don't think we could put that genie in the bottle or close back in the bottle or close Pandora's box. Derek, that was a pretty hot take. What do you think about that one?
No, you've said it on the show too. It's
should we be funding other people's nuclear programs?
We should be giving.
Well, we do it for Israel.
Charity.
I mean,
nukes for everyone.
Yeah, we're probably doing it for Israel, right?
Atoms for war.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's, again, the question of what this could look like in the end. Is there going to be a return to pre-2022 borders? Is there going to be a return to pre-2014 borders? Is there going to be a return to, or is there not going to be a return to that? Is there going to be some annexation? All of these, it would be great if there was some sense of what either one of these belligerents is willing to accept. Not what they say publicly,
right.
but what they would be willing to accept as an end state to the conflict. And that, I think, would help inform decisions about how much and what kind of weapons to give the Ukrainians. There are always cases like cluster bombs, which should be banned, period. They shouldn't exist, that they're easy to oppose, but at the deeper level, how much of this should be going on, I think, has to be informed by some track of diplomacy, somebody talking somewhere about how this could come out, and I don't see that happening right now.
Do either of you have a sense of what would be, I mean, if we are to believe, and I don't know how much I believe this, if we are to believe that the United States has the ability, and maybe it does just on a pure level of like I don't know if Joe Biden could say unilaterally tomorrow, no more weapons for Ukraine and survive the next 3 weeks. Like, I don't know. But let's just, we're in the world where Joe Biden could say, like, okay, I'm going to call Zelensky, and here's the deal. There's no more weapons unless, you agree to this as an end game. Do you think that conversation has happened? Is there any way for us to know, which I would argue is probably not, and what do you think from the perspective of everything that funnels into Joe Biden and comes out his mouth on the phone to Zelensky? Like, what do you think that is?
I think it's like you said, it's quite difficult to know, but from, open source intelligence, i.e. reading what people say, it's pretty clear that the U.S. foreign policy establishment likes this war for a lot of reasons and wants it to continue for a lot of reasons. My guess is that there isn't an enormous amount of pressure within the administration to broker a peace deal. It's very good for U.S. defense contractors. It's very good for weakening Russia. And I think the most important thing for U.S. policymakers is that this really has reshored up the transatlantic alliance, which was attenuating over the course of time. This has given NATO a steroidal shot in the arm that it wouldn't have otherwise have. So I just don't see any of the pressures to push toward a true diplomatic solution. And we would have seen something if there was. But just what someone like Lloyd Austin says or what Antony Blinken says, they're like, yeah, we kind of like this war. It kind of allows us to get to achieve all of our goals without us having to invade or without us having to commit troops.
And Derek, before you answer, Daniel, it's not your impression that we are saying, don't do this. Like, it's not like Zelensky wants to go and negotiate a peace and give up half the country. And we're like, you're not allowed to do that.
No, that is not my impression. I mean, but granted, crazy shit has happened behind the scenes and only the documents will show. But no, that is not my sense from how people have been talking about this war. Like, if Zelensky is like, we want to end it tomorrow through a diplomatic solution. Derek, I'm curious, what do you think? My guess is that the U.S. state would try to support him in that. But barring that, I don't know why he would do that. It doesn't really make sense for him for a variety of reasons. Barring that, the U.S. war.
There's no reason to think that Zelensky would want to do that, and I'm not sure. Honestly, I mean, to paint the bleakest scenario, I'm not sure he would survive if he did it at this point. And so, yeah, I don't see him being incentivized to take that step. I think it's more likely that it would come in the other direction, the one that Sam sort of alluded to, that the U.S. would say, here's the deal. We'll continue to support you. We'll continue to send weapons, but you have to be willing to accept this or that. And I don't think that conversation has happened either. I would find it very incredible to learn that it had.
Daniel Bessner, Derek Davison, co-host of the American Prestige podcast, and one of the authors
Foreign exchanges.
Of foreign exchanges.
I'm a subscriber.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah. I love it. It's one of my favorites.
I've been showing up a little bit. Okay.
You've been helping me out booking Thursday guests because we're trying to do some foreign policy people. So I steal from you slightly. I
knew that would pay off though because you're subscribed. So I'm getting your money. So
exactly.
Now we know how it all works.
That's how the sausage gets made.
The influence operation.
Guys, we'll put a link to the podcast and to the Substack. Thanks so much. Really interesting conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
All right, folks. We went a little long. Oh, geez. We went really long. But an important topic.
Yeah.
That was good.
Folks, you can support this program by becoming a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, you not only allow the show to survive and thrive, but you make the free half free of commercials, and you get some bonuses with the fun half, and you feel good about yourself. You can walk around with a little bit more of a swagger. You can walk up to people and say, I'm a member of the Majority Report. And they probably won't know what you mean. But if you say it with enough confidence, they'll think it's a big deal.
Yeah, it's like an exclusive club that they have to be a part of, too.
theoretically,
It's all in the
you could
selling
do
of
this
it.
without becoming a member, but
that
would be wrong.
Yeah.
Also, don't forget, it's jointhemajority.report.com for that. Don't forget justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. And you can check out our email newsletter, amquickie.com. It's free 3 days a week. If you want 5 days a week, become a subscriber. But it's free 3 days a week. Get the top news stories every morning, 9 a.m. It hits your email box. So check that out. Also, cedarseeds.com. If you live in a like a growing zone around like maybe 7, 8, 9 all year season for those seeds. cedarsseeds.com. Emma, what's happening on ESVN?
Well, 4 p.m., which is when the show starts, is a very important deadline for the NFL. It's the tag deadline. So we'll be going over these running backs probably not getting long-term contracts, what that means for their labor in the NFL. We'll also talk about the epic Wimbledon final, the passing of the torch. I actually watched some tennis yesterday, which I haven't done in a while. But we will chat about that. Titans snagging D-Hop and more. YouTube.com/ESVN show.
Matt, Left Reckoning.
Yesterday on the Left Reckoning Twitch channel, the VOD of which is still up, I watched a movie, Northern Lights, which is the docudrama that led to the documentaries on the North Dakota farmer labor socialist movement. Watch that. And tonight for patrons, we're doing our patron show. David and I are going to do a catch-up and talk about how it's insane how there's this discussion of how everyone should be so impressed by the American economy because of how good it is doing compared to the G7, and why isn't sentiment up? It's like, do any of you MFers pay rent? Like, people's income might be up. You look at like where you're going to move to next. I think that mystery is completely solved.
Well, also, in many respects, the rest of the G7 doesn't rely. The well-being of the people in that country,
because they've decommodified essentials,
don't rely on their health of their economies in the same way that we do in the United States.
And it's one thing for people like Matt Iglesias to argue that, but like we need our progressive rapid response folks to not be so confused about this stuff.
Well, and the other problem is that to the extent that that our economy is doing better, it is a factoid, as it were, that is not being deployed in the way that it should be. It should be deployed in the sense that, like, hey, we can spend more on people,
more stimulus,
and it's not going to hurt things. Like, we can take half the children out of poverty, and guess what? The sky doesn't fall. We don't turn into Weimar, Germany.
Yeah, was it Meyerson in the Prospect that had like an article on the sort of like tightened labor conditions because of what we did during the recession? So. And it's like, that's all good, and I think we should applaud that, but I don't think we should tell people like, well, that's enough for you to vote for Democrat. I think it's just, we got to say
it should be deployed in a way that promotes more of those policies.
Yeah.
All right. Two IMs I'll read. International Socialist. Sam, as you only read out my IM when I insult you, Sam, today you look like a fish-faced hierophant.
Hierophant?
I don't know the answer with that. And Ryan and Callie says, the danger is more nations have the bomb. Eventually, one of them will feel the need to use it. And with the rise of fascistic leaders, Modi, Netanyahu, Trump, some lunatic will bomb a perceived or real enemy. Iran having a nuke might stop a rational nation from attacking it. But religious fanatic fundamentalist Netanyahu, the entire GOP, Modi aren't rational. I tend to side on the favor of the more countries that have a nuke, the more likely a nuke's going to go. I mean, Donald Trump was like, why can't we use them limited over here? And, you know, we were fortunate that his entire administration was not 100% filled with 100% lunatics. I don't know about a second administration, but there's no guarantee that some other country like this, the law of averages, are going to line up at one point. And that's like, that's the one time I believe in the 1% doctrine.
Yeah.
Where, that one time that the forces align, I would not be in favor of
potential world apocalypse. Yeah, I mean,
I am, incidentally, I want to make this clear, I am against global apocalypse.
Whoa.
Yeah. Bold stand. I mean, that was one of the books we had Ellsberg on, is the Doomsday Machine, and you look at like the history of that and how close in certain situations we've got, and I mean, I don't know how
in supposedly a country, and I think it's legitimately true that we are one of, maybe we're not the only one, but we are one of, let's say, a dozen or two countries that have like some forms of checks and balances in a way that I think some other countries don't. Yeah. Right? I mean,
and let's not forget, we dropped 2 atomic bombs.
Yeah.
We are the one nation on Earth that dropped 2 atomic bombs, and that's different, of course, than nuclear weaponry, and I'm sure, honestly, there will be increased discussion about that with the release of this movie Oppenheimer. That sounds silly, but but it's going to be talked. I mean, it is unconscionable, the fact that we dropped those 2 weapons and killed and maimed so many Japanese people in a way that it did not need to happen, of course, and the chemical effects for that population were felt for decades and later.
And we had to tell stories about how benevolent or useful or important it was that we did it.
And I'm hopeful that at least like this big movie coming out like has people thinking more about what our role in the
maybe we should check in with
I imagine it's not going to have that.
Well,
apparently apparently it is. Apparently it's supposed to be about that. What you're thinking?
I don't trust it.
Nolan's politics.
I mean,
I don't either. But I mean, either way, we should have
check
someone
with
on
Greg Mitchell
about
this, because he's written about this and extensively over the years. So maybe we can.
I'm bracing it, I guess, is all. But
yeah. Who knows? We'll
all right. See. Quick break. Fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Oh no!
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it to my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman!
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ Danner.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense.
See, white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males...
Psych. Fuck them. Snowflake says what? What? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black.